You're sure? Oh, that's... Okay, we're going. Right, okay, welcome to the Beach and Cliff Geography Department mind map of issues facing Kenya's development. So, what we've got here is a whole series of issues that are associated with Kenya that are all linked to its development. Now, for a bit of history on Kenya, Kenya gained independence from the UK in 1963. Back then, the life expectancy was about 40 years. That rapidly rose to about 62 by the 1980s. Okay, as they developed reforms, health services, etc. AIDS, HIV in the 1990s hit Kenya fairly hard. The life expectancy went back down to about 52 years in the 1990s. Okay, so it's been a bit up and down, but things are starting to pick up again. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the kind of some of the main issues. We're going to start with health, but I think the key thing with this project is to look at this not just in the context of health or infrastructure, but in the wider context of Kenya's issues. And this is a really good activity to do at home. Some of this information's come from the booklet, the AIB, but an awful lot of it's come from our reading around the subject, our lessons, and the websites on the back of the AIB. So this is the kind of stuff you should be able to produce on your own if you're doing the work. So, we're going to focus on health. Now, we're going to look at sort of the main issues from a health perspective with disease. Diarrheal-based diseases, malaria, tuberculosis, and in the last 20-30 years, HIV/AIDS are the main killers in Kenya. And the key thing to pick up for these, certainly for diarrhea, malaria, and TB, is they're very preventable. Diarrheal diseases are generally linked to bugs, which leads to diarrhea, which leads to rapid loss of salts and fluids in your body, which can cause death worryingly quickly, but it's also like super easily prevented, okay, with education and fairly basic drugs. Malaria, which is a massive issue across eastern and southern Africa, is spread through mosquitoes. Mosquitoes thrive in sort of damp, stagnant areas. They thrive in lowlands, and they thrive at certain times of year. So again, malaria is one of those things that, with fairly basic things such as malaria nets, such as basic medicines, it's the sort of thing you can deal with. So again, education and some fairly basic drugs and provisions would allow malaria to go down. Tuberculosis is something which can be immunised against, and HIV/AIDS is increasingly prevalent, and whilst there isn't necessarily a cure for it, things like antiretroviral drugs, the booklet gives an acronym for it, which I forget. These are very expensive, but if you have them, you can massively improve the life expectancy of people who have contracted HIV and AIDS. Okay. Now, something like HIV/AIDS really connects to things like the wider health issues connected with the demographics, such as how you encourage family planning, use of contraception. Obviously, that's HIV/AIDS is largely passed through sharing bodily fluids or sharing needles. So education about these things are really important. So, fundamentally, they're the main issues with health. Okay. One of the big things we looked at in terms of why people's health is not improving as quick as it should be is the cost of drugs. We found that 30% of sick people in Kenya do not seek healthcare, not because they can't access it, but because they cannot afford it. So if you're looking at the issues with development with health in Kenya, and Rise for Health are worrying about infrastructure, then really 30% of people, if not infrastructure, is not the issue, it's the cost of it. Also, certain programs such as malaria, such as HIV, do get budgets from various development organisations, the Gates Foundation, the Pepe Project, DFID. What we've noticed is investment in malaria is decreasing as investment in HIV is going up. So maybe there's only one pot of money from international donors, and this is having to be shared, or it's changing. So you've got a kind of potential either or issue. So when we looked at the main issues associated with health, looking at that bottom left-hand corner, provision of supplies is clearly an issue. particularly in rural areas. The lack of doctors and nurses, which we're going to come on to right now. So one massive issue here is Kenya doesn't train an awful lot of doctors and nurses. It doesn't have these skilled sort of higher education facilities. The problem they're finding with this is that because it's got a fairly weak economy, doctors who would, Kenyan doctors who are trained in Kenya who would like to work there often end up moving overseas. In the year 2000, a survey found that 51% of all doctors emigrated. And this is primarily due to the lack of funding. Okay, if you spend the last sort of 7-8 years of your life training as a doctor, you deserve a decent wage. If the Kenyan government can't afford it due to the lack of money, often you're going to go overseas, especially if an overseas country such as the UK is going to welcome you with open arms. So the lack of doctors and nurses is an issue. Also, we've got roughly 4,500 doctors in Kenya. Over half of them are based in Nairobi. So, although we've got a high population density in Nairobi, it's by no means everyone, it's only a small portion of the population. So then if you go outside of Nairobi, you've got a real lack of doctors. A couple of stats for you on doctors. In 2011, there were 0.18 doctors per 1,000 people in Kenya. This is contrasted to someone like the UK, who have 2.78 doctors per 1,000 people, which in a way is quite a shameful stat for us, but it shows how few doctors there are in Kenya. And in fact, even within an African context, Kenya has a below, compared to the average number of doctors per people in Africa, Kenya's got an awfully low number of doctors. So you've got a real problem there. You can then come on to issues with, say, the financing of the health service. Now, we've read various different statistics and websites here, but the WHO, the World Health Organization, recommend that $34 per capita and per annum should be spent on healthcare, as in $34 per person per year. Now, we've read estimates that range from 6 to 29 US dollars, which is what Kenya's spending. But either way, all surveys conclude that Kenya's spending on healthcare is well below what the World Health Organization considered to be the absolute base minimum. So you've got massive issues of financing. And that's obviously going to impact on supplies, as in the drugs available, as in can they afford antiretroviral drugs if they don't have any money. It's impacting on the training and provision and holding on to doctors. And then we're going on to things like infrastructure. So, this is the point, this is the thing that Rise for Health are fussed about. Now, Rise for Health are a small NGO, there's only about 8 of them. They've got 40, 50 bikes, and their whole point is they're providing healthcare for people, but they're not providing healthcare. They are providing the logistics. They're taking the healthcare from the main urban areas to the people that need it. Okay, that's their kind of niche. That's their kind of unique selling point as an aid organisation. They're not doctors particularly. They're not trying to provide vaccines. They're not trying to provide drugs. They're just trying to take it, what they call the last mile, that last little bit of the journey that the drugs need to get to the people in the rural areas. So, infrastructure is the issue. Now, that's their argument. Only 14% of roads in Kenya are paved. Therefore, you can't get the drugs from where they need to be, from where they are to where they need to be. The drugs and the people are concentrated in the southwest, around Nairobi, around Kisumu, the large population centres. They're not getting out to the rural areas that need them. So, Rise for Health's focus is on the bikes. It should be pointed out that something like infrastructure, i.e. roads, railways, etc., are very expensive. And there have been quite a few projects in Kenya recently to try and develop this, particularly encouraging foreign direct investment from places like China to get them to do the job for them. So clearly infrastructure is an issue. It has other benefits. So if you focus on infrastructure to help with health, you've got to think about the other benefits that can bring. So if we look at something like trade, for example. Now, Kenya's employment sector slash sort of balance of trade is massively skewed towards the primary sector. You've got 75% of people in Kenya working in agriculture. Half of those people are subsistence farmers, i.e. they're not selling any of their crops, not earning any money. Now, However, if you look at the GDP of the country, only 25% of this comes from agriculture. So essentially, loads of people are working as farmers, but it's not really making any money. An awful lot of it's cash crops, tea, coffee, sugar, that kind of thing. But it's a cheap export, okay? It's an unrefined cheap export. So exporting cash crops, as a rule, is not a great thing to do. Now, what you've then got to consider is where the money's coming from. Most of the money in Kenya is coming from secondary and tertiary industries. Tertiary particularly focused on tourism. Only about 25% of people work in secondary or tertiary industries, but the vast majority of their income comes from it. So, if we improved infrastructure, would we be able to improve trade? Would you be able to access more foreign direct investment, allowing more investment in things like secondary manufacturing industry? Would you be able to increase tourism? Tourism is the biggest economic sector in the country. But being dependent on any one economic sector is always a problem. So, if you improve the infrastructure, it would benefit health, which is what Rise for Health is saying, but it would also have benefits for trade. So things like building a new port in somewhere like Mombasa might allow a special economic zone to be set up, which would allow foreign direct investment. Better road facilities will allow tourists to access other parts of the country, and it will allow industry to spread west from the coast inland, or from Nairobi outwards. So you've got this kind of trade versus aid issue. Again, they're also in a trade deficit. Their exports are cheap primary products. Their imports are expensive manufactured goods. They've got roughly a $10 billion trade deficit, i.e. their outgoing trade is worth about $10 billion less than the stuff they buy in. So again, you know, you've got a weak economy, you've got a poor trade issue. So you've got this kind of trade versus aid issue, which is what Dambisa Moyo was always talking about. She was saying actually aid's not what they need to develop trade. Okay, so there's another thing to look at. Now we can keep moving around here, and we can consider things like, well, why hasn't trade been developed quicker? Why aren't people willing to invest? You've got NICs like China with bags of money looking to invest in new countries. One of the big issues here, and this is a real key issue for Kenya, is its corruption. Kenya is ranked regularly in the top 10 most corrupt countries on earth. So even within a continent which is characterised by things like corruption, Kenya is still very near the top. There are estimates that bribery and fraud cost the economy around $1 billion a year. So all that aid, all that foreign direct investment being thrown at them is not going to the people it's needed. It's got a weak government. It's got a poor, it's very, very poor strength. And that's causing loads of problems. If you are an NIC or you're a TNC looking to invest in a foreign country, are you going to go to a country that's full of corruption? Are you going to want to invest in something knowing full well that a significant amount of that money is going to end up in the leaders' pockets? It's not going to help improve the country. Is it worth investing in a place where something like the roads won't necessarily get built properly, bribery is going to go, fraud is going to happen? So is it going to take away the confidence in investors? And it clearly in the past it has. Investors have been put off investing in Kenya as a result of this corruption. The last couple of years they've had a new government come in. This new government's really trying to stamp this out. But you don't change these things overnight. So it's a gradual change that's needed, but it has really held Kenya back. It's really held the chance of just trading back, and that's a real problem. Okay, so you've got that. Now, another point worth making on a whole different issue is the demographics of the country. Okay, so what we noticed here is you've got a massively youthful population. It's kind of a stage 2 moving into stage 3 country. You've got a total fertility rate of, I think in the 1970s it was around about 8.1, i.e. 8.1 women, children was the average number of children a woman had in her reproductive lifetime. It's come down to about 3.9 average. This is lower in urban areas, higher in rural areas. So you've got a big issue there, okay? You've got a youthful population, so you've got a really high dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is currently around about 85%, i.e. for every 100 people that are economically active and working, there's 85 dependents. Now this is better than say 20 years ago when it was 115%. So it is coming down, so the country is developing into a stage 3 country, but clearly if you've got loads of young dependents not working, that's going to help. That's not going to help, is it? So if you've got young dependents not working, they're not paying their taxes. They're not paying their taxes, they're not helping the government out. If they're not helping the government out, they're not working, and it's going to slow the development of the country down. You've also probably got a lot of people in the informal sector, none of whom are paying tax. Now, an interesting point about Kenya's development and about the money it spends on health, which we said wasn't very much. Now, a lot of countries in Africa, you might expect their health budgets to be largely dependent on donors. In fact, in Kenya, it's only about 14% of their health budget is provided by donors. The rest of it is provided by the government or in country. So in a way, this is a really interesting point because it means they're not dependent on aid. However, if you're relying on 86% from within the country and your country's not got a lot of money, then how are you going to get loads of money spent on healthcare? So you've got an issue there of, do we try and trade, do we try and develop that way? Do we need to try and encourage more aid? But then you've got the issues with attracting more aid and the problems that leads to. Yeah, so it's not just infrastructure, is it? It's always other issues. Now, that takes into account quite a few things. Debt, if we're looking at the country as a whole, the debt is an interesting one. Most African countries, as I'm sure you know, have had historical debt from European countries, from the World Bank, that kind of thing. The debt's always been roughly 30% of their GDP, okay, which is considered manageable. What's happened recently is Kenya, in the last 10 years, in response to its acknowledgement that it needs investment in infrastructure and its poor economy, it's been borrowing really heavily in order to develop infrastructure projects and make some of these big changes that are necessary. Now, Kenya's debt has risen to over half of its GDP, which basically means they're getting into greater debt in order to fund some of these projects, which in theory, in the long run, is considered to be okay. But the danger is if the infrastructure is beset with corruption, then you're not getting the same benefits that you could be having. So you know, if you're going to borrow money and get into more debt, then you need to make sure it's being used usefully. A couple other points we're going to make before we finish up is water and basic sanitation. Now, clearly, the diseases we looked at the start of this, i.e. diarrhoea, malaria, tuberculosis, they're all connected to water. Okay, diarrhoea is generally down to dirty drinking water. Malaria, it's stagnant water, it's dirty water where mosquitoes live. They're probably the two big killers. Only about, if we look outside of Nairobi, only about 50% of people have access to clean water. So if you're looking at, perhaps, there are some treatable diseases, many of which are associated with dirty water. One of the big issues is the fact that we don't, maybe they need to work out the water system. Okay, so if you're considering the best ways to deal with this, you need to consider, do we need to get clean water in? Now, this also links to our final point, which is about the rural-urban divide, which you should know by now. Roughly, 80% of people in rural areas about 70-80% of people in Kenya live in rural areas. All right? These rural areas don't have the infrastructure in terms of roads or railways or clean water. These people do not get as much money spent on their healthcare. So we're saying only about 20% of people live in urban areas like Nairobi, like Kisumu. However, the vast majority of money spent in healthcare is spent, 80% is spent in these urban areas. So you've got a massive dichotomy here, 70%. So whilst only a small proportion live in urban areas, the majority of healthcare is spent there. So again, you've got an issue there of funding. Well, why aren't rural areas being funded? Is it the infrastructure that they need, or is it the fact they just need more funding with doctors, with medicines? Is that what rural areas need? Obviously, rural areas are generally poorer. Obviously, they've got all those other issues. So you've got those kind of issues. Now, the whole point of this, if we take a step back, is that it's not simply health or infrastructure in Kenya which is causing the problems. The key thing is that there are a whole series of issues, some of which connect together. By solving one, you may solve several, but you can't look at any one in isolation. We're going to leave this here. This will be on the wall in Y3. This video will be online. this isn't extensive, this isn't exhaustive. All right, this is the kind of thing you could be doing at home and you could be adding to. We will put up some more videos for other sections of this unit, but this is a really good starting point for you. Anything else to add?
Enjoy.
Enjoy, thank you.